Welcome to TCU-FIESP Challenges in Brazilian Economy, Quality of Public Expenditure, International Experiences and the Opportunities for Brazil. This is the third of 5 events of the seminar cycle TCU-FIESP, Challenges of Brazilian Economy, that both institutions will promote jointly along the year. The seminar cycle views to qualify the debate on present challenges that the countries have been facing to establish fiscal rules systems in the post-pandemic scenario, especially as to assure the fiscal responsibility, foster economic growth, and to meet to the increase of demand for social protection. Today we will discuss possibilities for reforms and the budget framework with this international learning to allow efficiency increase and better quality in public expenditure needed so the public expenditure can leverage economic growth and meet the social demands in Brazil. This event is being broadcasted live by YouTube, TCU's channels, and FIESP's channels. And now we'll listen to the Vice President of the Federal Accounts Court, Minister Bruno Dantos. We ask you for a few moments because we are adjusting the transmission.
Ok, já voltamos.
Transmissão ok? Autoridades presentes, senhoras e senhores.
Ladies and gentlemen, authorities, good afternoon. Welcome to the seminar TCU-FIESP, Challenges of Brazilian Economy, Quality of Public Expenditure, the International Experiences and Opportunities for Brazil. This is the third of 5 events of the seminar cycle TCU-FIESP, Challenges of Brazilian Economy, that both institutions will promote jointly during the year. The seminar cycle aims to qualify the debate on present challenges that the countries are facing to establish fiscal rule systems in the post-pandemic scenario, especially as to assure their fiscal responsibility, foster economic growth, and meet to the growing demand for social protection. Today we will discuss possibilities for reforms in the budget frame with international learning as to allow the increase of efficiency and quality of public expenditure that are necessary so the federal budget can leverage economic growth and meet to the social demands in Brazil. This event is being transmitted live by YouTube in the official TCU and FIESP channels. We will now listen to the Vice President of the Federal Accounts Court, Minister Bruno Dantos. Good afternoon. I greet, first of all, the President of the Federation of Industries of the State of São Paulo, my dear friend Josué Gomes, a partner for coordination and organization of this seminar cycle. Doubtlessly, Josué, your arrival to the presidency of FIESP brought this breath of hope that we should all be aligned in building a fiscal framework, a normative framework to allow regaining growth. I like to remember it was in a visit I made to FIESP where the idea of doing in such a relevant year, which is 2022, with general elections, a debate to escape polarization, which doesn't interest Brazilians. We are interested in solutions for our crisis. When I say our, I don't mention, I don't mean only our country. The pandemic followed by the war threw the world into a terrible uncertainty state, a state of disorganization of the production chain. FIESP certainly has been following this even closer than our institution, the Federal Accounts Court, and all this leads us to the need of being together, hand in hand with the ones that have responsibility to build good solutions in the country. And from 2023 onwards, after the hiccups of the electoral year, we can implement a growth agenda. So I greet you, Josué, and also the state attorney from the who has contributed hugely for public debate regarding the control of expenditure, fiscal accountability, quality of public expenditure. So it's a privilege for me to be here with you, Rodrigo. I also greet all other panelists, people from the press, ladies and gentlemen. My first word, as I mentioned, is of thank you for your presence, not only physical, but the ones who follow us by YouTube. I used to joke around that the YouTube transmission refused to happen because this is a sign we are saying goodbye to virtual events. We have to come back to the in-person events, and maybe because of this, these transmission problems are becoming so frequent, Josué. So as I mentioned, first I'd like to thank you. We've reached half our journey, our seminar cycle, and today we discussed something that comes in the line of what we established since the beginning: make diagnosis, draft solutions for the Brazilian state, with the aim to make it better ready for the contemporaneous challenges. And Rodrigo, we've had care to present different perspectives about the problem, including an international view, once we have a lot to learn with the foreign experience in tackling these same challenges. In the first event, it's good to remember, done in the same room, we focused the challenges that the countries, not only Brazil, have been facing to establish fiscal rule systems in the post-pandemic scenario that should allow the goals to assure fiscal responsibility, foster economic growth, and meet the increase for social protection. Second event in FIESP, President FIESP over there in São Paulo, we discussed how to integrate the investment agendas, infrastructure, economic growth that's so necessary to our people. Specialists in national experiences, international experiences, discussed strategies able to assure growth and qualification of the investments in infrastructure in Brazil. We approached sustainable development, regulation, and governance. In this opportunity, our focus will be the quality of public expenditure. Our country, you all, ladies and gentlemen, know, has experienced a meaningful limitation of budgetary finances, and that places us in a dilemma where to guide public expenditure. Brazilian society has a meeting with a serious debate about prioritization and quality of expenditure. In a scarcity context, such as the one we are in, destination of resources for a given public policy that's pre-existent can't be automatic anymore. We have to reassess periodically the results that can be reached with the action considering more effective alternatives. We must develop mechanisms for our reality that should allow the reassessment of policies, prioritization of demands, and guidance of public expenditure in an institutionalized way, assure that the choices can be democratic and qualified at the same time. So that the people's representatives should make the best decision informed from technical elements provided by the competent institutions. By the nature of their competencies, President Josué, and because of neutrality of your institutional positions, the Federal Accounts Court has the ability to participate and present substantial elements for assessment of quality and results of public policies. And it can contribute with the executive branch in enhancing the programs and also aiding the National Congress with useful information for the performance of the inspection ability. This afternoon's goals is to debate possibilities for reforms that should perfect our budgetary framework to leverage economic growth and meet the social demands in our country. But the discussion beginning today will have continuity soon. In the fourth phase, and I'd like to remind the ones who follow us, we will debate possibilities to provide more rationality and transparency to the revenue and fiscal problems that this court has reported for a long time. And in the fifth phase, my dear Dr. Rodrigo Medeiros de Lima, we will assess alternatives for structural reforms in the legislative budgetary process. I have no doubt, my friends, that bringing these issues for discussion, TCU is providing better public debate, and who knows, induce concrete enhancement of the Brazilian institutions. I wish you once again good afternoon, good debates, good learning, and thank you once again, FIESP, for your valuable partnership in undertaking these events. Thank you very much. The President of the Federation of the Industries of São Paulo State has the floor, Josué Gomes da Silva. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Esteemed Minister Bruno Dantos, Vice President of the Federal Accounts Court, and greeting you, I greet all ministers and the qualified technician team and TCU. For us in FIESP, it's a great honor to participate in this cycle of debates. The idea appeared in the lunch where Minister Bruno Dantos was here with us discussing about the relevance of leaving this polarization situation where on one side you plead the minimum state and on the other hand it seems that people wish for a maximum state. In our understanding that for the good working of the economy, the state shouldn't be either minimum or nor maximum, but necessary, only efficient. And then in this lunch, the idea of this debate cycle popped up, and I think it's a very relevant contribution that TCU and us here honored are taking to Brazilian society with quality, high-level debates. We are already in the third cycle, and we will have another two. And I'm absolutely sure to say, in the end, we'll have proposals that should be relevant and structural to enhance the quality of public expenditure in Brazil. I greet also the prosecutor of TCU, Rodrigo Medeiros, and greeting him, I greet everyone who listens. We understand, Minister Bruno, and all the ones listening to us, that one of the main components of a good fiscal policy is following the public policies, their efficiency, their results. So, in order to allow quality of public expenditure, we understand without the state as a partner, as a planning in the economic field, Brazil will hardly reach economic development, which is growth with obviously social impact. To minimize the major social problems our country still in this bicentenary of the independence lives with. And by the occasion of the bicentenary of the independence and an electoral year, nothing could be more important than discussing mechanisms, the efficient mechanisms to promote quality in public expenditure. And then a partnership with TCU, whose technicians are really excellent and make FIESP participate in an extremely qualified debate. And therefore, Minister Bruno, our thanks for having allowed us to participate in this partnership and thus contribute so Brazil should choose the right paths to grow in high rates once again with the participation of the state, but without the large oversized state, but only necessary state to reduce the social problems in our country. I'm absolutely sure this cycle of debates is being very fruitful and will bring very relevant recommendations that doubtlessly our parliament, our executive branch, our judiciary branch, the three powers, the three branches that should live peacefully can embrace as an instrument for modernization, for the budgetary formulation in our country. So I'm happy to contribute to the debate. So once again, congratulations, Minister Bruno and TCU to promote such a relevant country for debate for our country.
Para uso da palavra, o procurador do Ministério Público junto ao TCU, Rodrigo Medeiros.
The attorney from the public advocacy will take the floor. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I'd like to greet our authorities, workers, panelists, the authorities who are in our virtual audience, Vice President of the Court, Minister Bruno Dantos, President of FIESP, Dr. Josué Gomes, and thank you for the opportunity of participating in an event with high quality, with a theme that interests me and brings enthusiasm to the debate. The debate was suggested by TCU and FIESP on quality of public expenditure is I consider the main fiscal problem in the country and a challenge to the legitimacy of the size of the state and its transforming and distributive functions imposed by the constitutions. The panels we will see will use two promising fiscal management instruments for reassessment of public expenditure that when used together have been showing relevant impact in the enhancement of the expenditure. They are the midterm expenditure framework and the spending review. They are two possible institutional enhancements to our framework that can contribute for better quality of expenditure as highlighted by some panelists like Renato Ribeiro, Daniel Curo, Paulo Bijos, just to quote the ones I had the opportunity to find out about their work. The midterm expenditures is not to reestablish a limit, pluriannual expenditure limit, like the Amendment 95 of 2016, but there's the definition of a pluriannual budgetary planning, like the different areas in the government that indicate how this fiscal space will be used according to the norm, allowing a better knowledge of the limitations, more political engagement in a review process to amplify governmental space of realization. This political engagement, by the way, is pointed by literature as essential to the success of a expenditure review process. So the process has to be seen and restructured as an efficient mechanism for projects, especially in a limited fiscal space that demands adaptation of process with the policies, opening space to the legislative branch where the reform proposals will end and will need support to prosper. We lost the opportunity by establishing a ceiling with the restriction of the primary expenditure limit, turning the state providence, regardless of norm and proposal to review expenditure, we should expect governments should seek solutions in this sense in a fiscal restriction scenario to make their projects feasible and enhance social well-being. Reprioritization of public expenditure should be seen as the natural decurrency of the expected oscillations of preferences and unavoidable social transformations, potentialized by the quick technological advancement that demands training and requalification of workers, demographic climate change that need huge investment in clean energy and water energy. So the re-establishment of public, without re-establishment of public expenditure, we won't be able to reduce social inequality in the rhythm the country expects. For a few years, we have a bill in Congress to review expenditure with approval by the Senate. It's the PLS 428 from 2017 from Senator José Serra in the lower chamber as PLP 504 2018. We also have another bill, including from the reading of this bill, I suggested the court to create a easy access page in the courts with their operational reports to offer subsidies for the public policies developers. The proposal remains, so this should happen with better access and publicly accessible to the ones that will use the tool. The legislative bills are well, by not proposing a defined design for the procedure. Once there's no ready formula, even and this design should be discussed with the institutional sides in each country, and with the learnings we can adjust and enhance this procedure. I think, on the other hand, the projects should provide a more express connection to the TCU in the process, considering its constitutional competence, constitutional ability, and experience, as well as in assessing public policies as to their effectiveness that the court does in its auditing. Just to provide you an idea, the manual of financial auditing was first done in 1998, and from there, in the other editions, it has been enhanced in comparison to international auditing norms. The Constitution and the court's law offer an important channel to the legislative to propose auditing and require information assuring participation of Parliament in the process. The program assessment, where the policies are discussed, enhancements are discussed, as well as if we must not forget external assessments as a vector for knowledge dissemination. Other important contribution could be brought by the court through its monitoring and in different phases of the process to identify eventual vulnerabilities and enhancements. At the light of international best practices, apart from providing visibilities, amplifying, as we can see, it's an extremely relevant theme, and our panelists certainly will bring productive debate. With this, I wish you all an excellent seminar.
Neste momento, desfaça o dispositivo de abertura.
At this time, we are finishing the opening session, and I would like to invite the guests to take a seat in the first row of the auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, to moderate the panel that will address medium-term expenditure framework as of expenditure framework, as how expenditure framework can enhance allocative efficiency in the public budgetary, we would to call Igor Rocha. With the floor, Chief Economist of FIESP and moderator of this panel, Igor Rocha. Good afternoon to all. It is a great pleasure to be here again, mediating a topic that is so important for the country. This is the third phase of the cycle of FIESP TCU seminars. I would like to greet Minister Bruno Dantos, President of FICIEP José Gomes, and Attorney General Rodrigo Medeiros, so that today they made an opening already addressing my words, and today we will address the challenges of the Brazilian economy. The first panel, we will talk medium-term expenditure framework, how the expenditure framework of medium term can lead to efficiency in allocating public budget. And we will have many specialists with us, both in present and virtually. And so we would like to invite you to join us here to the table. I would first like to call Mr. Fabiano Cubano, which in this case is virtual, Ms. Renata Mota Café, and Mr. André Martinez, which are also virtual, Paulo Beijos, which is here in presence, and Manuel Pires, which is also here in person. Please. So continuing, first, we are here to open today's works. I pass the floor to Mr. Fabiano Cubano. Fabiano is Senior Economist of the World Bank for Brazil. And Fabiano, the idea here for this panel is to address precisely how international experience can be used, replicated in some actions in the case of the Brazilian public budget and finances. Sweden repeatedly is used as an example of managing public expenditure. In fact, implementing the medium-term expenditure framework. Not only Sweden, but other countries do so. The question I would ask is there a difference in the models adopted between the countries? And if so, is it also addressing the matters regarding the level of development of the country? Thank you, Igor. Good afternoon to all. I would like to thank, on behalf of the World Bank, thank you for the invitation to participate in this very important debate. On behalf of the World Bank, we would say that we are very happy to be able to contribute it, bringing you international experience and to discuss potential structural reforms that could help the country move forward in the following years. In fact, Sweden is an example, a very interesting example of implementing not only the medium-term framework, but also of a fiscal framework that is very well structured for the medium and long term. They have a fiscal framework very well developed, and the main purpose of it is to assure fiscal sustainability and transparency in the medium and long term. Their system is based on some main pillars. One is the establishment of fiscal goals. So they have primary, they have a limit for the public debt. They have a limit for expenditure, and their framework, when they developed it, they did not focus only on the central government. They have a broader vision of fiscal framework, so they include all the other entities, and thus they have a way to impose balanced budgets at national level. So in addition to these, they also have a medium-term framework where they adopt alto baixo based on macroeconomic projections, fiscal projections of revenue, and so on. And based on this framework, they will then develop their public budget. Obviously, looking from down to up, bottom up. This approach is bottom up. There are needs to finance expenditure programs and entities. So they bring this discussion so that they can have a fiscal framework that helps to finance the main government programs, and at the same time they acknowledge the limitations of scarce resources in the medium term. It's important topic that they work with is that they respect the integrity of the budget. So everything that is relevant needs to be in their budget, and all the important institutions are also part of the budget. These are principles that we carry on as good practices for the medium-term framework implementation. In addition to that, they have an external monitoring of implementation of the fiscal policies as external monitoring. There are other government agencies that follow up on the implementation of policies, and also agencies of foreign organizations. They have compliance rules for the European Union. They're part of the OECD, so they have to meet those standards, and also the IMF. Aside from that, it is important to bring clarity and transparency so that the fiscal structure governs political decisions and not the contrary. And they try to give enough transparency for the fiscal policies so that the citizens themselves can understand and assess the fiscal policy and how expenditure decisions are being made. And then the citizens themselves assess how government is conducting public expenditure. And another important point is that government expenditure are outlined and follow very precise rules. What happens in international experience, what do we see? This experience with medium-term budget began a long time ago because of the European Union and requirements that the governments needed to meet in order to be a part of the European Union. So what we see today is that those that have most elaborate expenditure benchmarks are the European countries, but there are other regions around the world that also have expense benchmarks that are more advanced based on performance, for instance, or based on the budget. So we have a lot of experience in Africa. They had a lot of support from the World Bank and other international organizations in order to help them to develop and reduce their poverty. So especially sub-Saharan Africa, we have successful experiences. Central Asia and East Europe also have interesting experience implementing such benchmarks. But at some extent, we have experiences in many countries of the world. A lot of countries adopt some type of medium-term benchmark. In Latin America, we have frameworks a little less developed, but focused on implementing fiscal frameworks with implementing fiscal guidelines, trying to define collections of expenses in order to prepare the public budget, and this is an inheritance of our fiscal adjustment programs implemented together with the IMF. So it is an inheritance of the adjustment and assistance packages implemented by the IMF. What international experience shows us in terms of best practices to implement expenditure. The medium-term expenditure benchmark helps to improve fiscal discipline and improve efficiency. So this is something positive that we can incorporate in the Brazilian framework. And best practices, the success of the implementation of a benchmark depends on public finance management systems that are well developed and that are the basis in order to prepare a good budget. It depends on having political support. It is necessary for them to be successful. Otherwise, the political system will end up you won't get the necessary ownership and support to in fact transform your findings or the suggestions that come from medium-term benchmarks into effective and real expenditure, because one thing is to plan the budget, another thing is to implement it. So the expenditure benchmark is very effective in designing pluriannual budgets, and there's another concern with the implementation of the budget. So you depend on having the different areas and agents involved in the benchmarks and aligned with the ideas, and they must be ready to take the benchmarks forward. And by agencies, we can refer to the Ministry of Finances, the agencies of expenditures. Everybody has to understand their role inside this expenditure framework, and from then on, as much as possible, they should try to carry out their own roles and to have this alignment between the top-down and the bottom-up approaches, in the sense that we have a package of expenditures, you have the expenditure needs from the spending agencies, and you try to bring both together in the best manner possible. All of this connected to a national strategy that prioritize expenditure decisions. This is very important to implement a medium-term expenditure benchmark. So I think I will stop here. I think I've talked a little about all of the topics. If we wish to do a bit more, we could do it during the Q&A session. Thank you. Muito obrigado. Thank you for this comparison. I would like now to invite Renata Mota and André Martinez, both from the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, to address the expenditure framework. The medium-term expenditure framework goes beyond the year budget. It has implications in future planning. What are the main obstacles and benefits in order to adopt it in Latin American countries, emerging countries, or even in Brazil? Renata. Good afternoon to all. For us, it's a pleasure to be here and also to be able to contribute with such an important debate for the Brazilian economy, alongside with such experienced people. I will begin with a more general view, how the medium-term framework can contribute to the Brazilian economy. Then I will pass the floor to André Martinez to talk about the benefits for Latin America. Well, the medium-term expenditure framework is a tool inside of the institutional framework to adjust. It allows authorities to deal not with estimates and pluriannual ceilings, but also detailed expenditure plans, and this supported by good macroeconomic projections, good understanding of the consequences of fiscal decisions. With this, the government priorities are included in the budgetary process in the medium and long-term view. The adoption of a medium-term framework is very defended because it is capable of fostering fiscal efficiency. But also, it is very important, its role in improving the quality of the expenditure, prioritizing strategic allocation of expenses, and fosters more efficiency in intertemporal planning, giving more transparency and predictability to those responsible for the budget. In terms of medium and long-term planning, it is important to note that it's not a matter of producing a fiscal document, but the framework could help manage the pluriannuality. It allows strategic use of budget, better connection between planning and budget, and thus its implementation favors a longer-term planning. With go beyond the 1 year, there are many problems that we face. Not only the fiscal scenario is going to be traced for many years, but in this perspective, we must put the priorities of the government. The medium-term framework allows us to connect budget and government plans, prioritizing expenses aligned with government objectives, which is leading us to having a better distribution of public resources. When during its design, we must differ between ongoing government programs and new programs. By separating these two, we can map out on one side how the current budget is behaving, what is our baseline, and on the other hand, what is the fiscal space that this current economic perspective is opening or not for the future years. And in addition to with the concern for fiscal balance, it also brings a tool that helps to strategic use of the budget. That because there is not much room for new projects, this is evident. And so we can see how we can analyze the existing projects are contributing or not to government priorities and goals. It can help direct choices and help meet the needs. And the environment that comes with stability, predictability, and transparency of a medium-term framework also allows us to improve financial management and budget management of other agencies which can work with a broader term.
Thank you very much for the invitation. At IDB, we are very happy to participate in the debate, which is of large relevance for fiscal sustainability, future of Brazil, and enhance government action, enhance the citizens' life quality. So, keeping on with what Renata said, we would also like to manage the challenges and barriers that we identified for elaboration and implementation of the midterm expenditure frame. So these risks are pretty important to be known. So in implementation process, we can avoid them stopping this tool being an exercise without connection to government reality and thus useless. So one of these barriers we believe is very important to consider is that these expenditure frames have mechanisms to collect the general framework, government priorities, with detailed expenditures, and all of them must be consistent in the midterm one with each other. And this is a very difficult aspect to build in the frame because it involves the creation of different institutions to allow this alignment. A second risk has to do with the generation of fiscal restrictions that are little effective. That because it's no use having a fiscal scenario for many years if it can't be reached. And the main problem as to this is the trend to overestimate the available resources for the projected period. And also, third risk is the technical ability of the institution in charge of doing the document to establish proper midterm scenarios. You have to have realistic and trustworthy methods of income and expenditure. So this projection should be done in the most transparent way possible to generate credibility in the different economic agents, and this tool should work. The fourth risk, already mentioned by Fabiano, is the commitment of public authorities with a pluriannual plan and the fulfillment of the goals. The projections should impose effective restrictions for management, establishing a clear frame for midterm public finance. So the challenges that have been identified in the implementation of this kind of instruments in Latin America, an assessment by IDB identified some issues that I'd like to share with you, and that often hinder the effective adoption of the midterm framework. They are done without the participation of the ministries that undertake the expenditures and have no commitment to establish what's in the fiscal document. Second issue that has been identified is that sometimes these instruments are and these provisions are done without the coordination between the different levels of government. And frequently, like in the case of Brazil, they have an important part of the budget reducing the ability to provide good quality in the pluriannual planning. And another issue that is of relevance is that the projections, the macroeconomic and fiscal variables must be done or must be based in quality information, so they should really have an effective indication of the midterm fiscal planning. Finally, I'd like to also mention that in this tool, it's possible to include fiscal risk analysis, to relate them to the climate change and decarbonization risks. This is an issue that's very important. As you know, climate change has increased intensity. If the time of the hydrometeorological events has increased, and that has important effects in government expenditures and revenues. So in midterm planning, you have to incorporate the possibilities for these economic and fiscal impacts to have good planning. Another theme that's very relevant is also related to the environmental issue, where we have technological change and regulation change in relation to the decarbonization of the economies and implementation of the Paris Agreement. Implementation of these agreements and technological transformation can create uncertainty on future demand of carbon and derivatives, what can impact the governments with revenues dependent on the demand for oil. This is obviously the case of many of our countries in Latin America. So to begin thinking strategically of how these revenues will be replaced in the mid and long term will be very important for the fiscal sustainability. And finally, obviously all these events, these hydrometeorological events, world agreements affect the fiscal policy, but it's also important to begin mapping how fiscal policy affects the environment from the revenue and expenditure sides, and have obviously negative and positive effects, and it's paramount to begin to work with this to have a coherent policy which should be aligned with the fiscal and environmental goals. Thank you very much. Thank you, Renata. Thank you, André. Giving it back to you, Paulo. Fabiano quoted international examples. Renata and André mentioned it very well. They mentioned the sustainability and fiscal issues. So giving it back to you, and a specialist above all in Brazil. We don't lack instruments since the Constitution of 1988 to bring a proper frame of our fiscal policy. LOA, PPA, LDO, all were created with this kind of side, but even so, we have problems with the proper fiscal policy. So I ask you the $1,000,000 question: why doesn't it work? What's lacking for them to work? And what can be done to change this reality? Good afternoon, Nigo. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, it's an honor to participate in this seminar that aims to debate and approach such relevant themes for Brazil. So you say the $1,000,000 question, and I consider the question challenging because could be answered from different sides. I can visualize at least two paths. First, an explaining side could come from the premise that our constitutional frame is good, but it doesn't work very well in practice because of administrative reasons, political reasons, governance, and governability. So a second side could be a more critical side, could raise the possibility that our model doesn't work in practice, not only because of those already mentioned issues, but also because of flaws of conception flaws in the model. I would prefer the second thesis because it has more to do with today's events. So which would be the possible conception flaws in our frame? As we have a short time, I would point towards the main one, which is the high complexity of our model. After all, we have 3 laws, budgetary laws, which is the pluriannual plan, PPA, the law of budgetary directives, and PPAs must be approved at each 4 years, and PPA and LOA annually. This arrangement is pretty unusual and in comparison to international experiences. There's one temporary budgetary law, but 3 laws maybe would be something to be questioned. And after 30 years of experience with this model, we could extract some learnings already. More laws didn't necessarily bring more quality expenditure, and might have brought some managing problems also. I quote the fact that under this model, we consolidated the understanding that PPA would be a strategic document used for program managing, and LOA would be a law that would be more operational, just for detailing those PPR programs in budgetary actions. So that's what generally is seen. What we might not see, at least with clarity, is that by doing that we break into pieces what originally could be solved in a single place, which would be the annual budgetary law structured by problems. The program budget by rule doesn't demand the kind of duplicity created in Brazil, 2 laws. This problem, I see Daniel Cury here, he was mentioned in a chapter we wrote for the book Reconstruction of Brazil in the 20s, where we had a general overview of the country's budgetary problems, and we pointed towards some reforms constituted by a tripod, preserving the relevance of a expenditure rule, and adds 2 other legs, which would be today's 2 topics: the midterm expenditure frame and the expenditure review. Second part of your question is regarding solutions or paths to take. To deal with this, I would like to begin with a clarification of some recurrent doubt on this thing. First one, like as our focus is the midterm expenditure, first doubt is where to fit it. What would DMP be, an autonomous institute, or it would be hosted by some existing budgetary law, PPA or LDA, or it would replace LOA. I'm going to mention this. So beginning by PPA, I understand that originally PPA would be the natural vehicle to receive KDMP by the design of the Constitution of 1988. So the issue begins to become more complex when we see that in 2000 the fiscal responsibility law gave to LDO the competency to establish fiscal goals in a midterm perspective. So since 2000 it began to get complicated to sustain KDMP should be instituted by PPA, because we already created for almost 22 years in this recent experience, we created a whole midterm fiscal culture around LDO, and this legal competency was taken to the constitutional level by amendments like the 102 from 2019. So nowadays I'd say the most natural place to receive KDMP would be the law for fiscal directives. And what would be done? It would be preserved as it is, and the difference is that it would convive side by side in a midterm frame, robustly built, as well mentioned by the previous colleagues. It's important that we have solidity in fiscal scenarios, and I understand Brazil since 2016 is in good company, since the independent fiscal institution was created that can bring technical projections to build midterm fiscal scenarios. So this is a general understanding of a proposal that was built recently, also by us in the lower chamber of Congress under parliamentary demand, and I will mention this now. Our colleague, budgetary advisor, Elio Tolini, is maybe the advisor that's with more experience internationally. And in 2018, he consolidated work he was doing for years and experiences he has with IMF missions to subsidize reforms in many countries. So he made an overflight of international experiences and consolidated an option inspired in the Swedish model that was also mentioned here today as a good example to subsidize the adoption of MTF in Brazil. So his text from 2018 that deals with the issue, and then this took part in the design of a bill which I will mention later. Just to clarify why Sweden. Some reasons were mentioned already, but it's a country that didn't get the proper attention from Brazil and the world. For a curious fact, Sweden was able to join very successfully social responsibility with fiscal responsibility. Sweden can offer the welfare state without any imbalance in public accounts. I will quote two emblematic numbers. Sweden works with public debt of 35% of GDP, which I consider pretty small for a country that wants to offer social well-being. But they can do that. But it solves some paradoxes that seem impossible, and they work with a zero deficit goal. In Brazil, we have some effort to have a primary. They want to have zero debt, but they are able to do it, except from some exceptions motivated by the recent crisis. Well, with this, we have a more concrete proposal being discussed in our Congress, which was formulated by the shared cabinet of Senator Alessandro Vieira, Congressman Felipe Rigoni, and Congresswoman Tabata Amaral. I don't know if you all know them, but they work, although they're from different states, they have a common vision that allowed them to work through a shared cabinet. This cabinet demanded from us doing a work to subsidize the subsidies for bills that we mentioned here today. I will quote the proposal that was already handed PLC from 2022, which is a trial to propose a new general law for public finance in the country in replacement to the law 400/320, which is from 64. That, in our understanding, is a little old because of newer needs in the country. But in general guidelines, this law is a part of a larger proposal. And I'll just mention the outline of these proposals. It wants to, going back to your first part of the question, proposing a simplification in our frame. Instead of 3 budgetary laws, we should reduce them to 2 temporary budgetary laws. So we'd have the LDO, the midterm expenditures, and the annual budgetary law, PPA, that up to date has gone through identity crisis. It would be restructured, and all its historical knowledge wouldn't be wasted. It would be channeled for a government plan that already exists and is foreseen in Article 84(11) of the Constitution. It won't be a law, but the plan was strengthened. Now it's a governmental plan. It was, I should say, analyzed with contents that, if you want to visit, are exposed in Article 5 of the PL, with long-term planning. So you have a strategy for development associated to key indicators for development, and with this, avoiding that KDMP would be a mere fiscal instrument disconnected from a country vision. This is the summary of the proposal. If you have any interest in knowing more detail, if not today, in another opportunity, me and Wellington Lima are at your disposal to bring new elements and general guidelines. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paulo. Manuel. Paulo addressed an important aspect, giving Sweden's example, which is a welfare state, addressing public finances in the best way possible. Examples that we make comparisons to in many countries, in America and others. Brazil, especially due to the pandemic, the recent pandemic in Brazil and in the world, experienced an increase for public services demands, especially in the health sector. And Brazil has this problem of precisely with a greater welfare state with a growing fiscal responsibility. Planning with appropriate fiscal management. And the MTF would also come to support this directions. However, there are practical and technical obstacles that may arouse, hindering the implementation of fiscal improvement. In your experience, you have been through academia, private sector. What are the main obstacles, technical and practical obstacles, to improve fiscal management in Brazil? Good afternoon to all. It's a pleasure to be part of this debate. I thank FIESP and the Court of Accounts for this invitation. Such an important topic, such an pressing topic. Igor, thank you for your question. The pandemic is an event that is very different than anything that we were used to seeing. So it is an event which the solution is intensive in terms of fiscal policy. So we've seen countries increasing expenditure, reducing taxes, so that the fiscal deficit increased a lot during this first reaction of government to protect society from the pandemic. Public policies were very diverse. There were public policies to protect the loss of income, credit subsidized by companies, subsides to reduce the workload, so a broad spectrum of policies and actions taken. We now are at a second stage in terms of the fiscal aspect, which is to design an exit strategy. Some decisions have already been made, and also trying to understand what are the permanent consequences that will demand greater attention from public policies. What will remain, what will be permanent for the following years. So these are the two debates we are facing now. And then you have a problem, a tempo of time. The urgency in increasing expenditure is much faster than the capacity of governments to seek restructuring within the budget in order to accommodate these demands. So this is a budget decision which will take place in a midterm, and not more immediately. And in face of the diagnosis, your question, what are the obstacles for us to do this in an organized manner and a sustainable manner, and that also meeting society's demands? I would like to note that the way I see this situation, three aspects. One is technical, one is more political aspect, and the third aspect is more institutional in nature. From the technical standpoint, first thing we must bear in mind is that to evaluate public policy is something difficult. It is not easy. I have many examples that I can quote. I will call your attention to two that came to mind right now. I was invited to, in 2016, I was in the Secretary of Economic Policies, and we had an agreement with the TCU to present an evaluation of a policy per year. And we evaluated the PROEX. PROEX is a subsidy for exports. We carried out a very good study, and we found that PROEX was losing effectiveness year after year. You could see increase in exports with subsidies and with the policies, but the effect over imports was decreasing with time. So this evaluation brought many questions to us to discuss if it should continue in the budget and so on. And it also raised many more questions for us to evaluate and address this subject. And we're talking about a program that, from a budgeted standpoint, it is very small. So the discussion to review expenditure for government planning, it requires an accumulated knowledge processing so that when you are in face of a situation, you are ready to take that opportunity. The other example I would like to mention is that in 2015, we created the TCU-FIESP working group on expenditure review, which came before the CINMAP, which is the Committee for Public Expenditure Review. At the time, we took the opportunity to look over FIESP, some labor policies, but all of it was knowledge that we accumulated for many years by studying this process. So this is the first issue. These instruments, they are very important, but we can't expect them to give us a short-term outcome. This outcome does not come in the short term. The second issue, which is political in nature, is that the path between technical evaluation and political decision is very complex. This is not a linear path. It is much easier to get a political approval to review an expenditure in some circumstances than in others, such as when in recession, it is easier to find fiscal room based on an organized process of policy evaluation. And this many explanations, very abrupt political fiscal changes cause insecurity. Another explanation that many times when you change the budget too much, you end up excluding people. And when we exclude people, people lose political representation and start to question the political class. So there's a combination of factors that is very complex for these instruments to be effective as we wish or we need. The third aspect is institutional in nature. We need to have budgetary instruments that privilege planning, and this is not always true. Fabiano, for example, talked about the budget of being able to give weight to the budget as a whole, a process in which the budget is the most important part and validated within the planning process. In Brazil, we have some fiscal rules that hinder this. Contingency, for example, is a short-term fiscal control mechanism that at the same time it helps you turn around political decisions that were made by the National Congress, and this leads to a chain of effects. We see a strictness in the budget in order to face the contingency. So the idea of strengthening planning involves creating budgetary institutions, fiscal rules that strengthen this process and that don't undermine it. So contingency is just an example, but there are other situations. And this discussion is broader than just implementing the planning mechanism in itself. So I'd call attention, in my opinion, in Brazil's case, these are the three main elements that need to be improved in order to address spending review and planning as something effective and that could create environments that brings together what society requests and demands with the possible allocation of fiscal resources. I will finish talking here, raising a few questions that I think we could talk about in order to move forward on this topic. First, seeking a better coexistence between governance mechanism and fiscal policies. Second, think about the budget in a more multi-year way, strengthen multi-year mechanisms for the budget. Third, which is relatively improve planning mechanisms for the government workforce, which is the second item of budget in the government, and we have no mechanism to control the government workforce. Fourth item is fiscal statistics. Without good statistics, we cannot good planning. This topic, we have historically progressed a lot, but we have had a few setbacks in the past years. Some very good experiences of creating regulation agencies for statistic and fiscal indexes. In England, we have the National Office for National Statistics. It is a good initiative, I think, for us to regulate good quality statistics that could be used to evaluate and plan the fiscal policy. Manuel summed very nicely what we still need to think about in terms of governance and in terms of data information. So today, Paulo also talked about Brazil's example, so many instruments, so many rules, and why does this does not happen. Renata André from IDB addressed the fiscal issue and linking it to sustainability, which I thought was very interesting, which today is a very imminent topic in public management. And also Fabiano addressing the international examples of implementing the MTF. We have reached the end. We are on time. We are punctual. I would like to thank you all, Fabiano, Renata, André, Paulo, and Manuel, that are here in person with me. It was a pleasure to have you here with us. I hope the audience has enjoyed it, because it is not easy to bring together so many specialists to address such an important topic, which is the budget and a more appropriate fiscal management, so that as a country we could offer better services to the population and have a more sustainable and appropriate growth. Thank you again, and now I will pass the floor to our MC. Thank you, Igor Rocha, and all of the panelists. At this time, I will invite you to take your seats in the auditorium.
Senhoras e senhores,
Ladies and gentlemen, continuing to moderate the topic of spending reviews as a house systematic evaluation, we invite the Executive Director Daniel Cury.
com a palavra, o diretor executivo da instituição.
The executive director of independent institution, Mr. Daniel Cury, has the floor. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank you for the invitation. Thank TCU. I'd like to congratulate TCU and FIESP on behalf of President Bruno Dantos and Minister Bruno. It's always good to participate in this kind of discussion. IFE, as you know, is pretty new, but has the main goal to contribute for the transparency of public accounting, and for the projection of the fiscal aggregates. We make this monitoring. It's our main goal as independent institution. This look from within Congress towards public accounting. So it's important to us to participate in this discussion, two paramount instruments, so we can move forward in improving our fiscal frame. Over the last years, the debate is very concentrated in the fiscal rules. The expenditure ceiling is the largest example, and next year this discussion will probably continue around fiscal rules, but it's a more structural issue about the planning instruments, and I think that's what we discuss here. And without this, I don't see how plain fiscal rules can handle the job, which is to have fiscal responsibility with social responsibility, which is what we need. We have an extremely confusing framework, as Paulo mentioned. Today we have over 170 instruments regarding our fiscal constitution. In 1988 it was over 70. It's a very large frame. You have rules that didn't need to be there anymore, and you have new rules that might not be so useful. You have regulation norms that didn't have to be in the constitution, and in this frame we will have to include these new instruments, not necessarily in the constitution, but it will have to be thought of. I think the lack of harmony between them is something that draws attention. I think now is the time, maybe next year, to discuss all this frame, and maybe the better solution best solution implemented is not relevant anymore. Maybe we have to rethink the whole chapter of public finance and see how we can rationalize all this. Two instruments that I consider of the most importance, the ones that are being mentioned here today. We will talk about spending review in this panel, and I think our table here that's partially virtual was very happy that we have Alfred Drigdaduc. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Alfred is specialist from the Public Administration and Budget Division from OECD. We also brought Julio that will talk about his experience as a member of the executive branch. Today we have CEMAP, the monitoring center of the public administration, and we will have the legislative branch perspective. Leonardo Ribeiro will bring all his knowledge, experience, not only on this issue, but in drafting bill of law, which is the PL 428 that institutes the spending review policy in Brazil. And finally, Leonardo Albernaz, that'll bring the perspective of the Federal Accounts Court. We have a public policy assessment process, and TCU can do many things. It audits public policies. It investigates the trustworthiness of data and assesses the performance. So this perspective is very important. I'd like to once again congratulate you, and I'll pass the floor to our first speaker, Alfred Drigdaduc.
Thank you very much for the Sorry, I'm muted. I think it works now. Thank you for the kind introduction. There's an echo on us. Let me see. Does it work well now? Oh, yeah. Okay. I'm going to share some slides with. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be able to speak on this very interesting panel today. And good evening from Paris. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Álfrún Tryggvadóttir, very well pronounced, my last name, my difficult last name. And I come from the OECD, where I'm leading the work on spending reviews. And today I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of what constitutes a good spending review process based on our analysis of practices in countries, and then have a short summary and kind of a opening for a discussion on what will be the next phase of spending reviews, specifically in the context of the post-COVID-19 phase, how countries will use spending reviews in the coming period. So first of all, let's take stock and look at what is a spending review. This is specifically important since the definition of spending reviews has been fluctuating, so to say. Spending reviews after the 2008 financial crisis had a really clear purpose. They were used to cut expenditure. However, with improving fiscal balances in most countries, spending reviews have been used for wider purposes. They've also been used to analyze the effectiveness and value for money of public expenditure. However, this is the current definition of spending reviews. They are tools for developing, assessing, recommending, and adopting policy options by analyzing the government's existing expenditure, and they link these options to the budget process. As such, the purposes of a spending review include, first of all, enabling the government to manage the aggregate level of spending, aligning expenditure according to the priorities of the government, and improving effectiveness within programs and policies. What is important to note here is that, as we know, the annual budget process in countries is very much focused on analyzing additional spending initiatives. And this is essentially what makes spending reviews so important to have in place in countries, is that they focus on all the existing expenditure in place. Most OECD countries are using spending reviews, also showing how important they are. And you can see here that they have been steadily increasing over the past decade or so. And today, almost all of the OECD countries use spending reviews. 4 of them are in the midst of implementing them, and only 2 countries are not using spending reviews at all, further showing how important they are for governments to have in place. We at the OECD have been looking actively, as I said, into what constitutes a good spending review practice in countries. And we've done this by working, of course, providing technical assistance to countries by actively talking to delegates, OECD delegates, and by just analyzing what is happening in countries. And by doing this, we've been able to identify a set of best practices for spending reviews. And I'm going to give you an overview of those practices now. First of all, to have a successful spending review process in place, it's absolutely essential that spending reviews have clear objectives and that the scope of each spending review is clearly specified. This is, of course, essential because you cannot do a spending review without knowing why you want to do them and what you want to get out of them. So first of all, the objectives of spending review, they must be clear. And they should be communicated to all stakeholders at the beginning of the spending review process. Different objectives have definitely different implications for the structure of roles and roles of participants. For example, if an objective is to cut expenditure, it has different implications than if the role of a spending review objective is to just look into the value for money of spending. So this is really important to have in place. Secondly, it's important to clearly specify the scope of a review. All expenditure should be suitable for a spending review. As we know, all programs, they can run their course and change, and therefore it's important for governments to consider all spending when they consider spending reviews. And it's recommended to take on a periodic approach to spending reviews. This allows government to schedule the programs it will review each year instead of just picking topics each year and going through kind of a difficult topic selection process. So we see the countries that are really successful, they do this. They often at the beginning of electoral term, governments, they roll out the programs that they want to analyze over, for example, 4 years. And then they do that in a set sequent way. Secondly, it's absolutely essential to identify distinct political and public service roles in the spending review process. And I would say this is one of the most important things to have in place is the political leadership. We see that this is an essential thing. You cannot go anywhere with a spending review without having that. And this political leadership is particularly important at the beginning, where the objectives and scope of a review are set. And then, importantly, at the concluding stages, where final decisions on adopting recommendations are made. And this is often when spending, kind of this political commitment tends to fade away, when you have to really decide on which results or options to implement. And then we also see in countries that incentives, they definitely affect the level of political commitment for a spending review. Many countries have incentives in place. For example, a ministry that is participating in a review often gets to keep a proportion of the saving that is found and reallocate within different areas in the same ministry. Secondly, civil servants or public servants, they carry out spending reviews. You cannot expect political leaders to be involved at all stages of the spending review process. They are the ones that prepare the analysis and scenarios for a spending review, and they are the ones also that implement the recommendations adopted from the reviews. Both the Ministry of Finance and line ministries need to have expertise in undertaking spending reviews, and we see across countries that they are actively building up capacities to do spending reviews in many countries. It's really important to have clear governance arrangements throughout the spending review process, where there are clear roles and responsibilities at all stages of the spending review process. And this includes what is expected of the Ministry of Finance, what is expected of line ministries, and other external stakeholders participating in a review. Many countries have adopted a twofold steering arrangement, where you have a steering group that is providing oversight during the review process. This is kind of like this high-level filter between the working group and the political leaders, and brings findings and recommendations to the relevant ministers. And then you have a working group that analyzes each spending review topic, and that consists of staff from the Ministry of Finance and the relevant line ministry. And in many countries, they make active use of external consultants in this working group. A really important point is to ensure integration with the budget. And this is importantly something that many countries not fail at, but they are actively trying to improve, to have this link between the spending review process and the budget process. First of all, it's important to ensure alignment with the regular budget process in a country. Spending review should be systematically integrated into the preparation of the government's budget. And the spending review timetable should be planned so that findings are available in time for the budget formulation process. And this is what many countries do and are actively trying to do now, align those two processes, so that the findings can be taken into account during the budget process. It's also important to align the spending review process with medium-term frameworks, as this definitely can improve the effectiveness of spending reviews. And I think, as we know, in many instances, the findings from a spending review, they cannot be implemented immediately, but they have to be implemented over a certain time period, over the medium term. Therefore, this medium-term horizon is really important to have in place. And then the third point here is that it's really important to align spending reviews with existing evaluation processes and performance budgeting. And those can have valuable inputs and should be available and used in the spending review process. And we see in many countries that they spend a lot of time on gathering data that is not in place. And really, spending reviews can identify certain data gaps in countries. And just to show you, this is from a recent OECD survey that we carried out in 2020. And you can see here that poor quality of performance information and lack of this information are the two main challenges in conducting spending reviews across countries. The best practice that we have identified, number 5, is that it's important to implement recommendations from spending reviews in an accountable and transparent manner. This is also an area that has been problematic for countries. First of all, spending reviews should conclude with clear recommendations. And the analysis that takes place in the working group should include scenarios and options for political leaders to consider. They can see if you do this, then you can take this route, and if you do this, then this has different implications, and this is really important to have in place. And then secondly, it's important to monitor the implementation of spending review decisions. And the relevant ministry or ministries is accountable for the implementation of the conclusion of spending reviews, and this is done in coordination with the Ministry of Finance. It's also important for the Ministry of Finance to keep an eye and monitor the implementation of spending review decisions and hold line ministries accountable. And this is, of course, in many countries just done directly through the budget process and through the medium-term expenditure framework, where you can see if they are delivering and kind of implementing the results from the reviews. It's important to ensure transparency of spending review reports and the framework as a whole. And we see this as a trend in many countries that the conclusion of spending reviews are available publicly. This definitely supports the integrity, accountability, and oversight of spending reviews. And in many countries facilitates the effective implementations of spending review decisions. Many countries also have the governance arrangements and guidance materials available publicly, where it's important. We can see that this can be a real success factor in many countries, because then everyone knows where they stand in the process and are on the same page. Then finally, it's really important, and we see that the countries that are really successful in carrying out spending reviews to update the spending review framework periodically. And the whole spending review framework should be updated according to ever-changing challenges. This is, for example, important, as I noted in the beginning. I mean, when you have difficult fiscal situations, spending reviews serve different purposes than if you have a good fiscal situation in a country. So you really have to take kind of the fiscal situation into account. And the framework should take stock of changes to the environment in which it operates, as well as reflecting on strengths and potential weaknesses observed within the current spending review framework. And then we see in many countries that they are setting up specific units for spending reviews, where the lessons from each spending review is identified so that they can be improved continuously throughout the spending review process. So those were the success factors that we have observed across OECD countries in conducting spending reviews. And then just to conclude this presentation, something that we have been actively looking at the OECD is how spending reviews will be used in the coming years, specifically in context of the post-COVID-19 period, and what challenges countries will be faced with. And we see that it's really important to carry out comprehensive and substantial spending reviews. And in this context, you should carry out reviews that cover a substantive percentage of the budget. This is really, we see that when you don't have this in place, political interest tends to fade away in many countries. When it's only about value for money or effectiveness, political interest is not as high as in countries that really look at a substantial percentage of the budget when doing spending reviews. It's really important to normalize spending reviews as a regular part of the budget process. As we noted earlier, ensure that they are fully embedded and aligned with the budget process, and also just to normalize that line ministries know that they have to carry out spending reviews. As I noted also, it's important to conduct the reviews periodically and minimize the need for annual topic selection process that can often be difficult in countries. It's difficult to get kind of like interesting topics if you just do it annually. And this also helps to ensure that reviews are comprehensive and closely linked to the priorities of the current government. It's really also important to make use of resources and data in place use external consultants. We see that the countries such as Denmark that has excellent spending review practices in place, they actively use external consultants. We know that budget people are really busy people, so you really have to make the use of existing resources. Supreme audit offices, we see in countries that they, the data from their side and also just the knowledge there is used in many countries. And then you have to make the most of performance data and really actively look into building a pool of useful performance data. And then, as also noted, what countries are really faced with, that they have to build up capacities to do spending reviews, both in line ministries and in the Ministry of Finance. We see that the old ways of budgeting kind of that have been really kind of like prevalent in countries are not necessarily compatible with doing spending reviews, where you really have to have analytical capacities instead of kind of this old-fashioned way of, as budget people tend to be more of an accountants. So this is important to note as well. And to conclude this, what is the future of spending reviews in countries? We know that governments will soon be forced to look critically into ways to prioritize expenditure and really facilitate reallocation of fiscal resources. A lot of spending has been going into systems across countries, so this is the time that governments need to take stock. History has also shown that if applied correctly, spending reviews can be an important and useful tool in improving fiscal outcomes in the coming years. And therefore, it's really important that so many countries have it in place and are thinking about actively implementing spending reviews. And then we also, just to note certain features, we show that practices in spending reviews, they continue to evolve across countries. And some countries are including a gender perspective to spending reviews, aligning gender budgeting with the spending review process. And then importantly, and a really hot topic in many countries, is the environment. A green perspective is also being included in spending reviews in a country such as the UK, Ireland, Greece, etc. And this is done to help governments meet policy goals on climate and environmental undertakings. So thank you very much for the attention today. Of course, later on, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Alfred.
Thank you. I thought this presentation was very thorough. I would highlight, she links very well what Manuel said. He talked about difficulties, technical limitations, political limitations, institutional limitations, and the first part of the presentation, of her presentation, brought the experience and gave examples of how the institutional, technical, and political aspects have to be involved in the process of building a tool such as this one. Another important aspect is that this spending review is intrinsically a tool connected to the budgetary process. So I think our great challenge in Brazil is to coordinate all efforts of public policy evaluation within an instrument that is linked to the budget and therefore requires the participation of all branches, mainly the executive branch and the legislative branch, which will approve the budget. One of these initiatives, as I mentioned before, is CEMAP. Within the executive branch, it is very successful and it evaluates, I think, more than 10 policies every year. A leg of the CEMAP evaluates direct expenditure, another one indirect expenditure, and to talk about the experience in the executive branch, I will pass the floor to Julio. Julio is Joint Secretary of the Special Secretary of Finance and Budget. He is my colleague from college, but, well, you have the floor. Good afternoon to all. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for the invitation on behalf of the Ministry of Economics to such an important topic. I'm very happy to see my colleagues here, Daniel, Curi, and others, Leonardo, both Leonardos. I have a few slides for my presentation for the Brazilian government experience This first slide, we try to give you a history of the institutionalization of public policy evaluation. Spending review requires maturity in terms of the evaluation of public policies. I would like to explain to you how we are working within this process. This graphic shows that this is begins in 2015 with JETAG, a temporary initiative to assess public expenditure with aim to designing the multi-year plan and tackling fiscal challenges. But even before, when I arrived in 2005, there was already a 17-18 decision to allow to calculate the subsidies and evaluate. So the issue of public policy evaluation, we have a history, we have a long history, and we are always trying to move forward. And it is important to move forward so that we can evolve in terms of spending review and these instruments, these planning instruments that we have. So 2015, we had JETAC. 2016, we noted that it couldn't be a temporary group. It needed to be something more structural. So we created the MAPI, a committee to assess public policies. In 2017, an important benchmark in terms of the importance of improving governance. So we implemented the SIGI with Decree 9,203. In 2018, SEMAS, a decree that addressed the subsidies. 2019, in the Bolsonaro administration, we strengthened the institutionalization of public policies with SEMAPI. There's a council with three secretaries, the Civil House, Ministry, and TCU has a strong relation with the SIGI. And here, from this decree 9834 of 2019, I highlighted some of the competencies of the SEMAPI, which is to approve criteria for the selection of public policies. These criteria must include the material, the criticism, and relevance. We have the possibility of forwarding suggestions to change public policies and include transparency mechanisms. This slide highlights the relationship between SEMAPI and SIGI. It is very important to have the support of the government in order to assess policies. Manuel mentioned the difficulty of assessing political, institutional, and technical aspects. We are seeking, with SEMAPI, we are trying to create a team that will increase technical issues and also will strengthen the evaluation of policies involving executive secretaries as well as the ministers within the SIGI. So SEMAPI informs the SIGI which policies should be assessed, involves the ministries, and also informs the outcomes of these evaluations. So this is to strengthen the evaluation and the outcome of the recommendations. SEMAPI, Monitoring Council, is divided into a committee that evaluates subsidies and one that evaluates direct expenditure, SEMAG. We at the SEXI, we follow up on these two committees. We support the work that they carry out, which are then forwarded to the SEMAPI. This graphic shows a little of the history of CEMAP's history. It was created in the form of a committee in 2019. We already have 4 evaluation cycles. In average, there are 15 evaluations per year, and then recommendations are presented to government units. We now, in May, June, July, we are beginning the cycle number 22, where some reports from previous cycles are presented to be assessed and approved by executive councils. Yet, in terms of evolution, the most recent years, in addition to CEMAP 2019, I would like to highlight the relationship of the public policy evaluation with the multi-year plan. The topic, the importance of strengthening planning. So in the multi-year plan already foresees public evaluations because of the process. And Constitutional Amendment 109 addresses, Daniel also mentioned constitutional changes. We took some important changes that are being regulated now. Our challenge now is to regulate a constitutional amendment 109. Basically, it strengthened the duty of public policy evaluation by including it in Article 37 as a main duty of the public administration. So it is a principle included in the Constitution in Article 37 and in Article 165, which talked about budget laws. It included the outcome of the monitoring of public policies. This amendment was in 2020 to strengthen the role of public policy evaluation, and Article 4 addresses a plan to reduce federal incentives and supports that are tax in nature. It is being analyzed by the Congress, but paragraph 4 still needs to be drafted. It will bring criteria, goal, procedures to evaluate incentives or benefits that are tax, financial, or credit in nature. So in the following weeks, we will present a bill that brings some ideas and mechanisms to strengthen, for us to strengthen the process of evaluation and include this in the budget cycle. As a final consideration, after showing you the history of the federal government's progress in terms of evaluation, I raise the question of the panel, and I will try to contribute in this regard. How systemic evaluation and learning can improve public expenditure. First, transparency. Here is the link of our website, which has the outcome of these 60 evaluations that we are already carrying out during our 4 cycles. It is very important for the Brazilian society to know how the resources are spent and the outcomes of these expenditures. So studies are available to the society. Another way is to bring these closer to the budgetary cycle. Strengthen planning, connect budget and financial implementation, and also evaluation inside a cycle that goes in cycles, one informing the other and then informing back. We need to bring the 3 areas together, as Dan saw, And the Department of Evaluation, it seeks to strengthen these duties. Another aspect is we will also face fiscal restrictions within them. It is important. Last week on Friday, we presented an evaluation report of revenue and expenditure with new needs of limitations. So it is important to know public policies to see where the resources, budgetary resources, will be allocated and where some limitations and cancellations will be maintained. We have also discussed incentive for well-evaluated policies. Policies that are well evaluated, we should include them within the budgetary law, observing conditions imposed, and those that are not well evaluated, we have to represent an option to redesign them or even to cancel them. So it is important to have political support. Many of public policies that we address, that we evaluate, they are defined by laws, and sometimes we conclude that they are not efficient, and we need political support in order to be able to approve changes, in addition to reduce connections. We have a budget that is very connected, and to reduce mandatory expenditures. There is little room to analyze other expenses. Manuel reminded X evaluation. I think it is important. We studied the security insurance. It is an assistance for fishermen. We cross data and we see that there are some malfunctions in the past, say 10 years. We have sent some proposals to change it, but when it came to the Congress, we were not successful. So it is important to have political support to strengthen evaluation of public policies. And then last, I would like to take the advantage of the presence of the TCU and congressmen to refer to our concern regarding bills that are analyzed in Congress, especially the PEC 63 that talks about the 5 years rules. It's difficult to talk about evaluation of public policies and face fiscal restrictions when there is a proposal like this that raises the expenditure and reducing room for other political or other public policies. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. I am available for Q&A. Thank you, Julio, Joint Secretary for the Special Secretariat of Finance and Budget, who brought a lot of the learning acquired during the past years in terms of public policy evaluation. As Julio mentioned, this is a challenge. It's a very old challenge. Ever since I entered the public service, this is being discussed, evaluating public expenditure, improving public expenditure. And I think we have matured in the past years, and it is very much based on CEMAP's experience. It's very clear to me that when we include an instrument as a spending review, the learning that we have built in CEMAP, it will be very important for the tool that we will establish in Brazil, and also in light of international experience. There are proposals. One of them was drafted in José Serra's cabinet, and Leonardo, which one is people that study this topic most. He studies spending review and how to internalize knowledge into a proposal that is feasible to be implemented here. So I pass the floor to Leonardo for his presentation.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank TCU and FIESP for the invitation to participate in this event. Minister Bruno Dantos, Rodrigo Medeiros, my friend Leonardo Albenaz. I'd like to thank Josué Gomes, President from FIESP, Igor Rocha, Chief Economist of FIESP. Thank you for collaborating, bringing this important discussion. I'd like to greet all from specialists from OECD who made a clear and didactic presentation on the subject. Greet my friend Julio, who showed that we are moving towards a frame for expenditure, a review that can begin with this system. And thank Danielle for your words. Danielle, a longtime friend who worked with the Federal Budget Secretariat. That was where I had the first contact with spending reviews. And I remember the history in 2010. I was in the fiscal studies coordination working with Julian. There was a specific field for fiscal studies, and I was very interested in this issue, spending reviews, and we are discussing the theme 12 years later, and I'm sure we are moving towards this kind of model. The presentation so my part is to talk about spending review in the legislative agenda, about the Bill of Law 428 from 2017. So on behalf of Cabinet from Senator José Serra, I'd like to thank them for supporting the ideas, the discussions, and I learned a lot with the Senator. He was a rapporteur in the drafting of the Constitution. I'd like to talk about the motivations of this Bill of Law. And here's, I have spending review in 2 words: fiscal rules versus standards. Today, in the TCU magazine from June, I have an article with José Roberto Afonso where we defend the new public finance code, and in one of the sessions, we bring a discussion between Vitor Gaspar, from the MIF, and Oliver Blanchard, who wrote a thesis with other authors, which was very sophisticated, from rules to standards. And that's where I come in with spending reviews. Fiscal rules are not enough to assure expenditure quality. That's a first thesis, a place for discussion. I will show you with a graph why we can think about this in Brazil. Second point, spending reviews comes into the discussion with the governance standard, and we bring about some old literature about rules and standards as a mechanism to induce behaviors, and fiscal rules are nothing more than limits, and here's the IMF concept, defined ex ante and applied on parameters. It can be a rule for debt, revenue, fiscal result, and the standards. Now we talk about fiscal procedures adopted ex post. This model has influence from Europe, 92 with the Maastricht Treaty agreement, but there's countries that don't adopt these mechanisms as a standard. I had the opportunity to study in Australia in 2017. When I explained our fiscal rules model to my teacher, he thought he was understanding what I mentioned. And he asked me, why don't you use this model if it didn't work out in Europe? Of course, he was being ironical because fiscal rules, I think it's interesting to read about what Vitor Gaspar mentioned, but it's important to try to think that the world doesn't is not about fiscal rules. We have to think that as governance standards are important, and here we bring spending reviews as a economic efficiency. We're discussing quality of expenditure, and for an economist, that's economic efficiency. It can be technical to deliver product or service to society with a smaller cost, or with the same cost, better quality product. And we also have allocation efficiency. You can do this right, but you can allocate wrong. So this is expenditure quality to an economist. So the spending review models has this rational base, value for money, which is a mantra for people dealing with resources and money. Here we have a graph known by many here. We began having it since fiscal deficit in 2014. In 2016, we established a limit. This was the bet, and we had the pandemic. The model is interesting because it foresees extraordinary credit to face emergency situations, and we see after the limit we began having better results from the fiscal point of view. Here I go into an interesting graph. So it's important to separate the social security regime and the treasury, and I call this alligator mouth, because when we look at it since 97, when we began having a social security fiscal deficit, we have to compensate with the treasury. So we only see this, but this adds to each other. So if we take from 2015 to 2021, the social security deficit, which was 1,43, doubled to 2,86. The deficit doubled, and we have been compensating with treasury results. If we look at percentages, 3 points, that's a fiscal adjustment. We come from a 0.58 result to 2.45 when we separate these results. The separation of results shows us that what happened to the investments. This graph shows that the public investment regarding other primary expenses dropped since 2009, 2010 are dropping, and the expenditure limit came in for a limit, but where's the quality for expenditure? There's no quality for expenditure. It's more of the same. And to make contingencies for investments when the fiscal responsibility law came. So the limit was important to control expenditure, but we come back to the first line. This doesn't assure efficiency in expenditure, and there is where spending reviews come in. It comes as a governance model, and then I want to make a compliment to Alfram for her presentation. The term she used, normalize, we have to normalize spending reviews. And we thought about the fiscal constitution of a country. It's not the constitution itself. I took this from another OECD criteria. It's laws that are difficult to be changed. We are talking about not LDO. We're talking about not a decree. We're talking about laws that are more difficult to be changed. And that's why we were motivated to bring spending reviews to this world. this more stable world. So it should be a state policy, not simply a government's policy. And so Congress could step in, because if we stay in the world of the decree, and the government has been doing excellent work with this, when we bring this to the fiscal constitution of the country, we are normalizing the instrument. And we brought this instrument being sent annually to the Congress, this bill of law approved by unanimity in Senate. We needed to discuss with the political parties more connected to the left, in the sense to think it was a fiscal austerity instrument, but Alpha explains very well that spending reviews is not reducing expenditure, but reprioritize expenditures. And we mentioned some commands in the project to protect social expenditure. That's the worry of the parties connected to the left. So it was a joint discussion, was very good, and it was approved. We thought of this sending the spending review to Congress to recover what they have in the US, which is the communication between the legislative and the executive branches. And I coordinated the work, and I connected to people who I trust and who I think are prepared. Elio Tolini, Paulo, this was your idea. I thought it was interesting when I saw in Article 84 the executive branch has to send the government plan. It's a law, and the spending review is a plan that can be used in the beginning of the term. We would begin the legislative year knowing what the executive wants in terms of fiscal area and agenda. And we also bring fiscal plurianity, which go hand in hand with spending reviews. Spending reviews needs the fiscal plurianity, because it analyzes the reference fiscal scenario. If we don't do anything, where do things go? Now, if we review the programs, what changes in the fiscal scenario, what we call baseline. So fiscal plurianity is brought to the project with the pluriannual frame of expenses, expenditures, to the program assessments, not only for subsidies, and that would be analyzed. And we have a huge difference between assessing a public policy and spending reviews. This is paramount. The key here is spending reviews necessarily has to appoint budgetary savings, not only assess public policies. You have to say it can be done with technical efficiency or allocation efficiency, expenditure quality. These are decisions from the program. So the point is, it's not only to reduce public deficit, it's to reprioritize. So it's an agenda for all of us. It can't be a fiscal agenda only. Obviously, you have to know what you're doing, prioritize spendings, and use this in a budgetary process. So there's a key in the project that unfortunately was we used a norm and not a law, but I thought this was the connection of these assessments with Congress. It's to institutionalize permanent committee to review spendings, and this should have outside advisory. So I'm in Congress every day, and I think it's paramount. We have many important commissions. One reassessment commission would be for expenditure would be paramount. So we would have an independent institution advising the committee, and in the end, so you can have this integration, the budgetary legislative process and participation of Congress in the fiscal issue is paramount. We mustn't struggle with the mandatory expenditure. The issue is not the problem. This is not the problem. In the long term, there is no mandatory expenditure. If it can be changed in Congress, there is zero rigidity in Congress. You have to assess, observe democracy, and in this budgetary process, as Manuel mentioned, this is not only evaluation of public expenditure. In France, they created spending reviews. Assessment of public policies is an input. You can assess public and private sectors. You can assess governmental procurement, waste. You can have a national public investment bank assessing, and the issue is to connect this with the budgetary process. That's a challenge. And moving towards the end of the presentation, we mentioned the essential actions to implement spending reviews in Brazil, mentioned by the OECD expert and junior. Political leadership and sponsorship are paramount. So I'd like to thank Felipe Souto for the opportunity to advise him in this point, because he wants to have spending reviews in São Paulo. So having sponsorship for spending reviews is paramount. Political leadership has to be involved. Training the professionals. Manuel Pires said it's not easy to assess, and that's true. If you move to the technical issues, you have methodologies and you have number tortures in all sides, but you have the academia participating, public and independent institutions participations is paramount. You have to have incentives for managers. I'll provide you an example. It's the carryover instrument I discussed with Paulo, the possibility of having your budgetary people spent the budget because he knew he had to spend it, otherwise he wouldn't have any more budget. So it's the impact of annuality in the budget. So in countries except Sweden, I think, where they have a flexibility for I will allow you to keep on having that budget if part of the difference in what you have budgeted and what you spent. So you have to have these mechanisms. So you just see what's going on outside. And the big issue, I think it's the point that gathers us how to integrate all this assessment with the budgetary process. I made a presentation that ends with thank you. But if you want, I have the annexes. This is quick. Afron showed us that the practice was crystallized after the 2008 crisis, and I have the American experience that I think is fantastic. If you take the budget from 2021, you have to eliminate duplicative programs, work in the end of the year spending. So don't spend in the end of the year. Let's try to see what we can do. So these are general guidance. And when you take this, the annex of the American budget, it's as if we had in our budgetary law, not in the execution. Here we have the initiatives and savings. So you see the programs you are reducing and where you're creating new initiatives. So this kind of experience is important to try to work in Brazil, and we need Congress and the executive together. And we have the barriers. We have to understand spending reviews cost time, energy, and money. It's not for free. I'll do spending reviews. There are expenditures, coordination. You involve everyone. You have symmetry of information between the involved parties. So some kind of bonus is important. It's coordination of the players. As Manuel mentioned, it's difficult to assess, so you also have obstacles. Now it's really over, so I'd like to thank you for your attention and place myself with the other colleagues at your disposal to talk about the issue.
Thank you, Leo. It's amazing the knowledge that you have gathered by studying this topic, and I think it's very important. Every time this topic is discussed, it's important to listen to you and take advantage of your experience and knowledge with regards to spending reviews. I see that there is a certain common aspect in all speeches, and also linking it with the first panel, which is the need of having political engagement. I think this discussion cannot be. Congress will have to be involved. Cannot be only a technical discussion. There needs to be transparency, and we must create incentives within this framework for the Congress to participate. Not only the Congress, but the high level of the executive branch. The Minister of Economic itself must be involved and must be familiar with instruments. So this knowledge is important in order to move forward with this discussion. Leo Albernaz, how TCU can contribute for the discussion on spending reviews. Thank you. Good afternoon, Attorney General. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to greet all of our colleagues that are here, our press colleagues. We have many issues, and mine is the last speech of the day, and there are many topics I would like to mention again, but I won't because we don't have time. So, what is the role of the TCU of auditing? How can it contribute into performance budgeting, and also within spending review, how could we be part of this? I had brought this first image here to remind us, but I think everybody has been reminded by this already. The discussion, at the end of the day, the distance between what we produce and when we see us, bureaucracy and academia, and the type of decision that is made, how the decision process occurs. And I remember 2 programs which involves inequality reduction, which is the assistant one in 2005, assistant to the household. It was created within the Ministry of Development, and there was monitoring and evaluation. A very nice work. The program grew and extended and became an efficient and effective program. And all comparisons that we have, we led a study last year destined to the Congress comparing the assistance to household to other programs. It was very efficient, but the usefulness to reduce inequality was not so efficient. Nonetheless, assistance to the household no longer exists, but the one of the assistance to the food quality exists. So we're talking about the need of generating subsidies for decision making. I'm talking on behalf of the TCU. We are talking about choices of public policies, and we are not a decision making body. We only advise on the decisions. Fiscal rules don't guarantee the quality of the expenditure, and sometimes it is the contrary. Sometimes it goes against. So we must consider, even in the beginning, in the opening, Mr. Dantos and Josue, the type of state that we want. It is a discussion that is political in nature. In the end, whatever the discussion is, if we spend a lot or not, there's a consensus that we spend with lower quality than we would need to. And so talking about the side of the one that has to provide evidence for decision makers. So how TCU performs to enhance plans and budgets. It acts on different fronts to save public money. If we refer to the pandemic, when 300 billion reais were spent with emergency assistance, we had a situation where we found problems in the figures of dozens of billions, and other agencies participated to recover some dozen millions of these resources that we lost with the pandemic. But this performance, which is one we can quantify, is not the main performance of the TCU. Its main performance is to improve public administration. So I'd like to share 4 issues of this contribution. The first one is auditing the performance of policies and programs. Many programs during the year, audits, operational audits, and the idea is to provide diagnoses, evidence, and eventually recommendations to build shared visions on how to improve policies and programs. So this is one thing that we do today. Secondly, is to verify the trustability of fiscal aggregates, to guarantee that the budget is as realistic as possible, so that we later don't have to suffer from the choices that we made. We choose to control the expenditure. Thirdly is auditing performance information. This is very important. We do this more typically for the president's accounts in terms of complying with goals in the multi-year plan, the quality of indicators. We have shown year per year, but 1/4 of performance information is not reliable. 1/4 of a finance auditing is that are not reliable is not enough. We need to qualify this information so that we have believable information to base our decisions. And fourthly, are the reports that make up the budgetary process. When we think about our three main reports, one is the government accounts that take a look at the previous fiscal year. It looks backwards and talks about what happened. And the other two reports, they are reports that are foreseen in the laws of fiscal guidelines, and they cover public policies and the fiscal public policies. The idea of these two reports is that they subsidize the Congress with information for the decision-making process. This information must be there, even if not taken into consideration. So we generate information. Are we making this information being read, heard, assessed, and discussion of having an institutionalized process of spending reviews that you increase chances of having mechanisms that the decisions go into the budgetary process. Evaluations are one of the sources of information. You have many other sources of information that may come from other areas. There's a big chance that there will be no outcome coming out from this, but TMAP has good evaluations, and they can't always transform. Sometimes it's not a matter of spending less, it's verifying if this policy could have a better efficiency if we remove incentives or increase. So, and thinking about that, imagining that we may progress and institutionalize spending review, then this is a very proposing discussion, 5 topics in which TCU could aggregate value to this process. 4th on this screen and 5th on the next. First one is to assist in making up the review agenda. We were talking about the periodic reviews, but rarely we will be able to do that every year. If you start with themes, how do you choose the themes? And TCU could help in bringing information to subsidize this choice. What are the areas, themes that deserve a periodic review? Second, subsidizing
cuidado com esse ponto, essa conclusão talvez esteja um pouco forte demais para as premissas que você tem. Então, ajudar a qualificar o debate, trazendo ali uma segunda opinião em cima da avaliação que já foi feita. E um quarto ponto, que seria auditar o próprio processo como qualquer outro processo. Ou seja, será que os resultados das spending reviews estão acontecendo conforme esperado? Daqui 1 ano, daqui 2 anos, está acontecendo, eu olho para trás, aconteceu como esperava, os resultados que a gente imaginava estão aparecendo? Então a ideia era, eu queria economizar nesses programas atendendo o mesmo público, será que isso aconteceu? Então auditar isso e trazer informação para o Congresso poderia ajudar a tornar o processo mais confiável, mais robusto, né? Enfim, mais rico para fornecer informações. E a última tela com o quinto ponto, o Paulo Bijo está ali, vai lembrar disso, que ele estudou bastante isso, né, no projeto com a CDE, é um quinto ponto que é uma discussão sobre a insuficiência que tem quando você analisa políticas públicas individualmente, o que é uma tendência quase sempre, de você olhar para aquela política específica, e aí você não enxerga problemas de coerência. Por exemplo, em alguns casos, uma política funcionando bem, ela concorre com a outra, né, atrapalhando a outra, e você não consegue enxergar quando você olha individualmente. Ou a gente não olha e não enxerga, né, falhas de coordenação dentro do governo, entre níveis de governo, entre órgãos diferentes, ou há casos de sobreposições que geram redundâncias e daí geram ineficiências que você não pode perceber se você estiver olhando cada programa individualmente, ou mesmo lacunas. Você tem os programas e você não está conseguindo coordená-los o suficiente para atender todo o público que você deveria atender. O GAO, que seria a versão americana, né, dos Estados Unidos, do TCU, ele produz um relatório periodicamente, né, anualmente, e é um relatório que economiza alguma coisa como uma dezena de bilhões de reais de dólares, né?
Dollars a year based on an analysis is a little different from what I wrote here. They talk about fragmentation, overlapping, and duplication, but I wanted to mention coherence so we can assess other aspects. The National Treasury could carry out this type of assessment. It could be a report that could be made by the TCU and could be in addition to periodic spending review. And the study could be carried out in the area that the executive branch is going to carry out their reviews. In this area, TCU could provide a report on fragmentation, overlapping, and coherence, and point out these topics, these problems that you find when you assess programs individually. At the end, all of these aspects are aspects that we already have in place, or we can have in place, but it is different in terms of how much more productivity you could have if you had a systematic process in favor of the discussions. So that's it. Thank you.
Nós que agradecemos, Léo. De fato,
Yes. From my experience, I can say the Federal Accounts Court has been coming closer to this quality issue. Not only the conformity control, but for 20 years the court has been looking more towards enhancement of quality in public policy, which is not only the identification of illegal practices, so the court can contribute in many processes, and Leo mentioned many ways this could happen. So I'd ask you to remain here. We will pass the floor to the journalists. First panelists are here in the first row. Paulo, Igor, if you have any if there are any questions, you'll have to answer. Manuel and the prosecutor, Rodrigo Medeiros. Fabio, would you like to ask a question? Fabio Grane from J. Thank you, Daniel. I will ask a question to Julio, and then there's something I'd like Leo Ribeiro and Manuel Pires to comment on. My question to Julio is, you mentioned SEMAPI, what's been happening in this field. From your manager view, what needs to happen so SEMAP, the assessments done by SEMAP should be incorporated in the budgetary process and translate into real change, opening space for other expenses. So from your manager point of view, with the budget, what is lacking so SEMAP becomes effective in terms of expenditure management? And the other issue is about, to Leo Ribeiro Manuel, is about how to make an assessment that should be free of ideology, something that wouldn't point towards a reduction of expense. We had the FIES issue, which was reduced a lot, but I have a question, which is, FIES was better with a larger FIES, with more people, or is Brazil now better that it was reduced but many people were left out? And also the dishonoration of the payments in second term of a second administration of Dilma. There was a bad assessment of a plan, and but this program has different evaluations. So how do you disconnect these evaluations from ideologies in the budgetary process? Thank you, Fabio. About the issue of becoming SEMAP more effective within the budgetary cycle, it's a process of maturity, knowledge gain. What I saw in the international experience, it's not so simple to take. Once there is an evaluation, you already establish a budget. We are in the process of gaining maturity, so the assessment is better heard when we do the budget. So this union will help in this line, but you still have a lot of rigidity, connection, the budget is still done based on the past, on the existing rules, bonding, so it's difficult to stop that through assessment. So, but we see we are evolving. We have, I think the most important thing is to work, as Leo Bernardes mentioned, to have other players informing this to Parliament, the results of the assessments, relevance to reassess public expenditure, because all expenditures have an interest to defend this expenditure. When you're dealing with job creation, there's a sector which benefits, but you need more players, more talking about the results and the cost, so you can bring people who make decisions to the table. So I don't know if I answered. Being more straightforward, what to do. I think we have to keep on in this process of evolving, to bring more information, bring more players to talk about the relevance of evaluation. We still didn't reach this design, but international experience shows it's not so simple. It wouldn't be a exclusive flaw to us. Before passing the floor to Manuel, I quoted the panelists here, but Alfred is also there, and with 4 hours difference. So Alfred is also here to answer to any questions. So Alfred, we've quoted the program that has been mentioned by the acronym, which is FIES. It's students financing for superior learning for college. So I'll pass the floor to Leonardo. This question is very important. There was a time I just inserted spending reviews in Google to see what was going on, and I saw that in the United Kingdom there is an interesting participation from civil society, because budget in the end is a fiscal restriction and a decision for allocation. Someone loses, someone gains at some point, and we realize when we come closer to spending reviews in the United Kingdom, I followed the issue in the health care field. Many institutions worried with the review, and practically Julio answered to the question in the sense there must be independent institutions involved, and it's not only fiscal institutions. Germany is an interesting case of a country that has many independent institutions in the process. In the sense, they have their own budget. They're public, but they have a fixed mandate to speak. The academia has an important role in spending reviews in the United Kingdom. We see universities showing numbers and results. It's a huge set of informations from interested parties. Media has a fundamental role, as we have the independent institution. This media qualification of fiscal data for society, because society will feel represented and will want to participate in Congress. So it seems to me participation must be as large as possible, involving the academia, independent institutions, society, all. That's why I think this permanent assessment, expenditure assessment committee in Congress is important. We have infrastructure commission, economic affairs commission there. I think expenditure review commission would be important, because this group of interested parties would go to this commission to put pressure, and it's part of the game. It's democracy. If in the end, after so much transparency and discussion, Congress would vote and approve the exoneration with some change in policy, some will think it would be interesting because there would be resources for other fields. But this is part of democracy. It's better than another system. Fabio, I'll answer specifically about these 2 programs. I had contact with FIES in GETAG 2015 when government delayed payment to universities, and it was bad, and we began to study and try to do an assessment of FIES and adjust the program. And in FIES, I had the opportunity to study the North American, the English, the Australian cases, 3 countries who went through recent reforms in study programs. So basically what we did was realign the income criteria to qualify the student as fit, and in the financial modeling we reduced the subsidies in 30% in the program. So this was the fiscal logic and this adjustment. When we established the modeling of the entry criteria with the reduction of the subsidy, this problem happened. Problem you mentioned. It was too large on one hand, and on the other hand, it excluded very much, as you mentioned. How do you balance this? You have to have fiscal resources. The answer would be this. Study programs have different problems in different countries. In the US, the cost of universities increased over the years, and families are not having income to pay for the debt. So that's the debate over there. Here, it's different. The problem is that people don't have income to pay for the university. So in my vision, it's not only redesigning FIES to find an excellent point, but keeping FIES for the ones who have situational FIES can have a difference. But the decision to increase ProUni is a fiscal decision. Either you reduce expenditure in some place, this has to be financially balanced, or you increase some source of income to fund a program like this. I don't see how to leave this dilemma. So about FIES, I would say this. About dishonoration of the payments, so Brazil overtaxes labor, system, education, salary, and things like that. So we're talking about a country that has the most taxation over labor. So this is a permanent agenda in the government. Dilma government tried to have some cost outing, and Paulo Guedes tried to create a tax benefit for the youngest. That's different ways of dealing with the same problem. Same way we have high taxes on labor, we have small progression on income. So you can use taxation over labor with less unbalance. You would reduce you could have other discussions in the passage. So a solution like this would solve the problem from the structural point of view. About assessment of cost outing, the most studies show there was some impact on labor, but with high costs. So it wasn't the best way to generate jobs. Cost by job generated was high. Good afternoon. I'm Murilo. My question is to Alfram from OCDs. Good evening, Alfram. I'd like to ask you a question regarding Brazil, where the members of parliament here, they can use part of the public budget for investment in their regions. But Brazilian media revealed recently that good part of these resources were being spent secretly. So we don't know exactly who are the members of parliament who are using this money, neither how it's being invested. So I'd like to listen from you an assessment on secret budget, considering Brazil wishes to join the OCDE.
this question. I mean, this is. Can you hear me all? I hope you can hear me all. I mean, this is quite specific, but I wouldn't say that Brazil is alone in this element. But like, is it that you like Parliament has a fund that they can allocate, but it's not done in a transparent way, as I understand it. That's the issue. I mean, yes, I mean, definitely Brazil is not alone there. This wouldn't stop any OECD discussion or anything like that. But this is, of course, something that would need to be addressed. And what we observe across OECD countries is that, and I mean, I was the deputy budget director in my tiny country of Iceland, which is of course a Scandinavian country. And I mean, this was something that we also faced there in a different way. I mean, it's a small country, but still, what we saw there is that when we improved the kind of the fiscal framework in Iceland after the crisis, for example, 2008 crisis, things like those, they improved. I mean, it's much more difficult to do things like that, and I hope I'm addressing this correctly. Of course, I mean, I don't have the full context. It's much more difficult in countries to do something like this and to act on something like this when you have a really clear kind of fiscal legal framework around fiscal situations. And I mean, when you have a top-down budgeting process, when you have medium-term expenditure framework, when you have spending reviews, everything becomes more transparent. So those are just like, it's very high level. I'd be happy to discuss this in more detail if you give me a better context. But as I said, I mean, definitely you're not alone in the universe with this. It's a problem faced by many countries.
Eu vou complementar a pergunta do colega. Eu queria saber
Question.
como as pessoas.
I'd like to know how people who are here think about making a better assessment of what it was called secret budget, because we don't know how it's being used today. If someone thinks about a mechanism, if there's a way of following this in a more effective way, because nowadays we don't know who sends how much to spend with what in many regions. Maybe Leonardo's could help. Julio, just making an observation. We had a recommendation last year, and good part of what was in the recommendation was taken over by the Supreme Court. So we need to have transparency and saying who is allocating the resources. That's basic. I think that's the path. And we have to do it the more natural, systematic way as possible to overcome this. So having the mechanisms by which the relationship with the ministry is not necessarily the Ministry of Economics, but sectoral ministries, and the discussions in Parliament should be transparent, and so we can tell society who's providing resources to what place. We're doing something to. We're talking about expenditure quality, but mentioning a more basic question, which is transparency. Who is placing the resources? Who's making the choices? The recommendations in the TCU, that's an environment where TCU makes recommendations because it's the president's accounting. And we have the decision of the Supreme Court, and that's the way of how this is going on. But it's the relationship to assure the meeting of what's being decided can provide this transparency.
This question, I was thinking about the 1988 Constitution, where the chapter on public finances brought a number of advances, and in terms of the legislative process, we must remember the period we were living in, passing from a dictatorship to a democracy, discussing the citizen constitution. And at that time, in terms of budgetary legislative process, there are articles that give certain autonomy to the National Congress based on their own rules to establish criteria for amendments, criteria to reallocate during the budget legislation process. The resolutions on the topic are various, and there is one that talks about the legal opinions, preliminary legal opinion. There is a certain independence, autonomy to decide. And it seems to me that it is important, this discussion is important for us to address the topic and for the political world, so to speak, can realize or naturally notice that the fiscal scenario, economic context, pulls this discussion towards enhancing these regulations. Paulo wrote about this. There are proposals, suggestions on the table to be discussed. I think that during this event there will be a day for the discussion, So I think that's where it's coming from strengthening the Congress since the drafting of the Constitution. And today we are facing a matter that the preach adopted by the executive branch, saying that Congress is the one who has the final word. I think that may have encouraged a political will of actually allocating. And this is in the discussion of spending review, expenditure evaluation, transparency. Spending reviews would also be a mechanism to help in this process of broadening transparency in the process of amendment, which is legitimate and is supported by the Constitution. So there is a certain independence there. But the work you're carrying out is very important, of placing the information and data, and I think there's starting to be room in the agenda for this type of debate to improve these instruments. There's a day, I believe, that I was mentioning the sequence of events. There are 5 events. This is the 3rd. There would be a 4th to talk about taxation issues and tax exemptions, and another one to try to discuss structural issues of the budget legislation process. There will be good discussions, I believe. I'm Adriana Fernandes, reporter from the Estadão. First, I would like to ask a question for the OECD representative. If this improvement in framework with the evaluation of expenditure, if new policies should look at specific accounts and should be addressing gender and the environment aspect, if these evaluations should have would they address gender perspective and environment? Should they be directed in this sense? So you mentioned a long history, and as a reporter I followed up on this process of evaluation. Some were disseminated to the press, others stayed in the drawer because there was political decisions to not reveal these evaluations because they are delicate topics. One is the one of tax exemption that government used to have document evaluation, and we're not taking into from.
I'm very sorry, but the translation stopped working at some point. So I heard that it was a question on green, gender, and will you include those in the spending process? So I probably missed the last part of the question, but so if you want to, is it coming or?
Se é eficiente, acho que foi mais ou menos isso que eu perguntei.
To guide towards this type of evaluation, spending reviews, and proposals of new policies, taking into consideration some topics such as gender and the environment, gender and environment.
From the translation, but I think like the question is about like importantly how countries are addressing different, because as we know countries have been implementing different reforms in recent years, one of them being green budgeting, for example. Very important to have that in place. Gender perspectives as well in budgeting, and I mean this is spending reviews are quite a big workload, additional workload on administrations, and then of course on top of that you have green budgeting and gender budgeting, etc. So just to summarize a bit, I mean, and I'd be happy if you want to send me the question again in an email, I can answer in more detail. But we see countries such as I mentioned earlier. I mean, we see the UK, who has a really excellent spending review process in place. The UK actively, as part of the spending review process, they actively look into environmental objectives during the spending review process. And for example, they do it in two different ways. So either you can just like analyze, I mean, different spending, like you can just think about where is kind of like inefficient spending taking place, and how can we reallocate that spending that's being spent not very efficiently on environmental issues, so that you can promote those issues, those very important issues. This is one way. And then you can also, it's called like a plus option spending review. You can look basically into if more money is needed to be spent on the environment. So as I said, many countries are doing this. And then Germany was mentioned as well. They are also both taking a green lens to spending reviews and gender perspectives. In general, it's extremely important to align different reforms that countries are going through and trying to kind of like lessen the workload also, and just creating a really efficient public service. So as I said, happy to take this question in more detail through an email if it was not answered correctly.
Thank you, Adriana, for your question. Going into the question made to Alpha regarding the goals that can guide the spending review and the efficiency and convenience of having green policies and gender policies. I think these goals are politically designed that are based on priorities of each country, and the green agenda is clearly a priority that is broad and covers all countries. It is a global emergency, so it is difficult to be against this type of goal, but still I see that as political goals. And here I call attention to the bill approved by the Senate to reduce inequalities. An important goal of reducing inequality, this should be a priority in the agenda. So I would say that this was a simple decision for the Senate to approve this. Regards evaluations that the government has, or for some reason keeps them in the drawer and do not address the recommendations, I see two consequences. The first is that apparently these evaluations are being carried out in a serious and exempt matter. Why are they putting them in the drawer? If they're putting them in the drawer, they are correct, but there is a flaw in the transparency of these evaluations, and it is the duty of the policies to adopt the recommendations or not. This needs to be transparent. So the fact that the government does not follow these recommendations is a possibility, and maybe the major problem is the flaw in transparency. But it is a political game, and this is the major challenge, as has been mentioned by many panelists. Every public expenditure has those who benefit from that, even if they are inefficient, even if they don't bring the expected outcome. Every time you discontinue a policy, somebody will lose something. As Leonardo mentioned, what we need to have exempt evaluations, external and internal, with the most transparency possible, so the electorate may be clear on what type of choice that is being made and which is being excluded. And the media is very important in this sense. It's important to see that the press must have access to this information and is able to bring this information to the community. So in terms of TCU, I could advocate for adjusting on transparency. This needs to be very clear. The outcomes of the studies that the government carries out with regard of policy, and those that are excluded and those that are taken forward. It's part of a democratic debate, and I think transparency will only enhance the quality of this debate, and the media is very important in this process. I would just like to assist a little in answering Adriana Fernandez's question. My presentation ended up, I already had my final remarks, my thank you, and then an annex, and the annex led to our website with presentations that have been made during these 4 previous cycles, and they were approved, and they are on websites. All studies are available to society in the most transparent way possible. But evaluation is a difficult process. You have a process of knowing what is what question you're going to ask, what database, what direction are you going, and then find an outcome, and then then you are going to present this outcome. And then the group that is going to assess this outcome is going to ask, did you make the right question? Did you use the correct database? So sometimes evaluations are so complicated that other studies are necessary. So the Ministry of Economy is willing to be transparent in every way possible. We support the transparency initiative. We ask all our colleagues here to help this movement, this evaluation movement, because at the end we will need political will to adopt some measures, and some studies, because of how complex they are technically, they might be able to be further studied. We are coming close to the end of the event. I will pass the floor to Paulo from Poder 360. My question is very simple. I know that simple questions are frightening, but public expenditure did it most to get better or worse in terms of sector, time, region, in terms of transparency? Leonardo Ribeiro shows investments that responds this question a little, but still we know that there is a discussion on productivity of the investment. Some people are critics, some says that the expense that is good is that called an expense. It's called an investment. We know that is not true. There are expenses that are bad, that are good, and not investment, and the other way around as well. So if it wishes to respond in terms of time, region. Luckily, I am only the moderator, and I need to pass the microphone to someone else. Well, the simple and difficult question. You have to look from various angles. I will speak on behalf of the Ministry of the Economy. Public expenditure in terms of the GDP. This is the first time that a government had delivered a smaller public expenditure than it received, from 19 such percent to 18 some percent. Given that we faced the pandemic, and even in this context, we were able to deliver an expense lower than the GDP. I think that is a good evaluation of the performance. But we need to look at the major expenses from the Social Security benefits, and after a lot of discussions, we were able to reach a Social Security reform that can stabilize this expense a little bit, so to have a better quality in order to avoid an explosion of this expenditure. The next one is expenditure with human resources. We need to evolve in this discussion, but in this government, we were able to bring public expenditure in human resources to the lowest level for a long time. So that's why I'm concerned with the discussion administration reform, extending the career, beginning with lower wages and growth based on outcomes, and then the 5-year package wants to put it all on personnel. So thinking about these two expenses in the middle of a pandemic, it seems to me that the outcome was positive and favorable. But there is definitely the need of bettering evaluation and opening room for other expenses such as investments. We must think of investments of the public and private sector. Sorry. Just to add to his answer, the graphic that was used in the Congress, we say the graphic was quoted. The graphic, it could be read with another graphic that the Treasury publishes that shows net investment, net depreciation investment, and all follows this graphic. It was negative last time, so we're not being able to cover some countries take depreciation into account in the budget. Not let the investment wear off. So the graphic shows that my response would be, Julio mentioned something important. There was a tax adjustment. The Social Security deficit doubled, and the Treasury made an effort to of GDP percentage points to compensate that. The outcome could have been worse, but in this case, for me, there was no quality in the expenditure in terms of allocation efficiency. In terms of technical efficiency, it would need to be further studied, but in terms of allocation efficiency, I think that we used a little too much of the same. We cut costs of the same, and now we are at a scary level in terms of what we invest. It's very difficult, and maybe the main point is that we cannot answer everything objectively. And if we speak of time recently, talking about cup half full or half empty, we have just overcome the pandemic, but we can't isolate factors. On one hand, the decrease in investment, which was expected, and it was clear that we wouldn't be able to do anything with mandatory expenses, and our rate of depreciation and structure, which is not what we would want, which is not desirable. How do you increase investment in infrastructure? The other factor being difficult to isolate, and when we look at our indicators, they are not good. You look at education, health sector, unemployment, they show that things are not going well. So there's the control on one hand to keep the expenditure with a percentage of the GDP, and the discussion today, if we can translate this into outcome in favor of the society. I think historically this is where we are failing. We have flaws. If we think of beginning of the 90s to 2015, our tax would raise more than 15 percentage points. So are we doing this efficiently and sustainably? Because we started delivering more services, and then when we couldn't increase the tax load, we increased the debt. So when we look at indicators, I think there we have problems, and in terms of planning as well. Not only general planning, we are not able to see the role the multi-year plan plays, but we also don't have a clear planning, what the indicators are. Fabio asked, how do you evaluate a factor? The choice of the indicator is already biased, but if we use the main indicators to measure economy, education, I think we will see the difficulty that we are living today. Not just considering the facts of the pandemic, which is something we need to recover from.
Well, I think due to time, I'll pass the floor to our Master of Ceremony to finish. We thank Mr. Daniel Curi for moderating the panel and also for the participation of the panelists. And to close the seminar, we invite the prosecutor, Mr. Rodrigo Medeiros. Good afternoon, everyone. I can state as I imagined we had an afternoon of learnings. It was interesting to listen to all panelists. As I mentioned, their reference and showed they deserve the qualification. The event's format was interesting, allowing an external look from relevant external institutions like the World Bank and the OECD that showed us our debate is not disconnected from the international debate about the midterm expenses, expanding reviews, and showed we have a good depth discussing international literature at the light of our context. Many panelists showed how they studied the issue and have thought it in regards to our own challenges. And I see with good eyes this debate moving forward. I come out with many learnings and anxious for more discussions regarding the theme. Thank you all, panelists, journalists. It was a huge pleasure, and see you in the next seminar.